Great, we're live. Thank you. Thanks for coming out today. This is a good panel. It's on data-driven cyber policy, and the caveat is from dream to reality. I hope that's true, and that's one of the things we're going to talk about today. Let me quickly introduce our panelists, who all have such long and distinguished careers that there's no way I could do justice to them in the 40 minutes we have. But at the very end, former Congressman James Langevin, I used to call him the godfather of cybersecurity on the Hill, and he was sort of the inventor and one of the only two people in Congress who knew how to spell cybersecurity about a decade ago. So thank you for being here.
Thanks, Jim.
After him is Jake Olcott, former congressional staffer, now at BitSight, and sort of an expert in this data stuff. Last but not least, Eric Goldstein, Executive Assistant Director. Did I get that right?
Close enough. Yeah, go with it.
Assistant Executive Director at the Department of Homeland Security's CISA, which you all know. And a graduate, I've been told, of the CSIS intern program. So there you go. What more could you want? My name's Jim Lewis. I work at a think tank in Washington. And we're going to start with a discussion. I have a bunch of questions for them. The general topic is we now have started to have enough data collected automatically and in such quantity that people can use it to shape decision making and policy. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Some of the things I've seen just in the last couple of years are astounding. You've seen a lot of effort now with CIRCIA and other things to bring data into the cybersecurity discussion. Let me start with one, though, for all three panelists. How would you describe our performance? You've all been in this business for a long time. Is the US doing better or worse? And how would you measure better or worse? Congressman, why don't we start with you?
So in terms of, and Jim, thank you, and thanks for your years of leadership too on cyber. It's been great to work with you and my other two co-panelists here today. And it's been quite a journey over the years. I will say, in terms of, is it better or worse? Yes, on both fronts. Certainly, we are getting better, but the bad guys are also getting better. So start with that premise. But back in 2007 or so, when I first began this journey into the deep dive on cyber and realizing how big this was going to be and how challenged we were going to be, there were so many things that didn't even exist at the time. There was no U.S. Cyber Command. There was no CISA. We have come a long way. You know, we do have obviously U.S. Cyber Command and NSA working very closely together. The work that CISA does is really incredible. We now have an ambassador rank position at state for cyber, and we have a national cyber director, and so much more. We have national policies now on cyber, including the executive order on cyber. From the Biden administration, who has done, by the way, a phenomenal job, amazing job in moving the cybersecurity ball forward. We came out recently with the national cyber strategy and the cyber implementation strategy, and just the other day, yesterday, I believe it was, the posture review of the cyber strategy. So all of these things have gotten us to a much stronger place in cybersecurity. What we don't yet have a lot of is sufficient data, although that too is starting to change and come in. The CIRCIA legislation that was recently enacted, and now CISA is in the process of promulgating the rules on that, and hopefully I'm sure Eric will want to comment on that soon. The SEC obviously has its incident reporting legislation, rule that went into effect. So all of these things are going to help with data, and so we have what have we done, but now we need to look more at outcomes and measurements. And I believe that the right thing, all of this will come about as some of these components, and including, by the way, a very helpful report that just came out from BitSight on how the KEV program, known exploited vulnerability program, have been remediated because of the work that CISA is doing. So we are getting to a stronger place. It's an ongoing effort. As I found out early on, there is no one silver bullet in cybersecurity. There is no one thing that's going to get us to 100% cybersecurity, but there are things that we can do to buy down our risk to make it those risks much more manageable than what they are.
Let me do early audience participation. Are there any CFOs in the room? I never get any. Because one of the reasons I'm here is that we had an event probably about 6 months ago with Moody's, and Moody's said something really interesting. This was longer than that. It was right when the SEC regulations came out. And Moody's said, we're going to start adjusting people's credit rating based on their cybersecurity performance. Lots of people in the room sat up when they said that. So I think that's part of why we're focused on data is we have a good idea of what works. Cav is a good example. And now we're looking for the market incentives, a big part of the national strategy to help drive that forward. But Jake, let me put the question to you. You've also been doing this for a while.
Yeah, I would just maybe add a little bit to what the congressman said. You know, when I do think back, we made a lot of decisions about cybersecurity policy based on what I would describe as anecdotes. You know, you would receive a briefing. You would receive a number of briefings. With that, you would try to piece together, you know, some policy recommendations about what should we do, how can we apply, you know, some information from some of those briefings to a larger, you know, to a larger audience or, you know, a broader industry or broader sector. You know, we would use very imprecise data like, you know, the theft of intellectual property and trade secrets has resulted in the largest transfer of wealth in history. You know, that was a line that was, you know, repeated and repeated and repeated, but, you know, how do we actually quantify that? That may be true, by the way, but how do we actually quantify that?
No, when you quantify it, it turns out it's not true, but that's different.
So, I think what we're really trying to get at is how do we get more precise? How can we become more objective? How can we become more quantitative in leveraging, you know, some of the data and assets that we are now collecting in order to make better decisions? You know, identifying some of the gaps that we may have, addressing some of those gaps and moving forward. So I think that's that's why I think what we're saying is, you know, from dream to reality, we are getting closer to that reality stage, and we do have some really kind of exciting things to talk about in that space.
So when you look at the history of regulation in the U.S., it usually takes somewhere between 25 to 40 years for a new industry to go from being, you know, startup, new, disruptor, to being mature. And when I see the attendance numbers at RSA, I think we're approaching maturity. It's also been about 30 years since the commercialization of the internet. So we're in a different world, and one of the signs of that, as the congressman mentioned, is, this is a lead up for you, by the way. One of the signs of that is we now have an agency that does this for a living, and I think it's actually doing a pretty good job. It took, 10 years to get CISA enacted? Hopefully the next fix won't take that long, but Eric, where's your view on where we are?
Thanks, Jim, and just thanks everyone for being here, and certainly thanks, Congressman, for your leadership in creating CISA and getting us to this point. It's a really great opening question, and it's one that frankly is really frustrating. So I lead cybersecurity at America's cybersecurity agency, and when I am asked the question about is America getting better or worse at cybersecurity, I have no idea. I have no way to empirically answer that question. And that's frustrating because if we look at other examples, when the Eisenhower administration funded and created the National Interstate System, there was also created, nearly simultaneously, a regulatory and measurement regime to track highway deaths and the causes of those highway deaths, which have led over the years to significant improvements in motor vehicle and highway safety that have resulted in a dramatic reduction in motor vehicle and highway deaths over time. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention track with great exactitude the pervasiveness of causes of death in this country and the differentiation of different diseases and comorbidity factors that have allowed significant investments in public health. And actually there is a centuries-old history in understanding cause of death in a way that informs medical innovation and actually disproves treatments that don't work and offer advancements for those that do. And then we have cybersecurity, where, as Jake noted, we have suppositions about leading indicators that might indicate that a breach is more or less likely to occur. We have increasing volumes of data about the threat and about vulnerabilities, but we have terrible data on the actual outcomes, such that it's actually really hard for us to even say, what is the outcome that we want to measure? Is it open vulnerabilities? Is it intrusions? Is it the harm caused by the intrusion? And if harm, is it financial impact? Or is it disruption to the services upon which our communities depend? And so I agree that we've come a long way and that we now have an agency. We have a really big conference. We have more data. But we are still at an infantile state in actually understanding what is the outcome that we are trying to achieve as a community, and then what are the indicators that lead to those outcomes. I see two areas of hope. One is, at an enterprise level, individual organizations are actually getting pretty good at this, at least larger and more mature ones, right? So larger organizations understand their business risk, understand their risk tolerance, understand the technology risk metrics that could lead to a breach in that risk tolerance, and they can drive investment to keep their risk within tolerance. That's really hard to aggregate out beyond the enterprise level, but it's at least a model we have that works fairly well. And the second is, we are at the precipice of actually getting real data that we can use to do similar work as the CDC, similar work as the National Highway Safety Administration, or NHTSA. And that's through the Cyber Incident Reporting Rule, or CIRCIA, that Carlos Melandriman was so instrumental in getting enacted into law. Because when CIRCIA comes into effect next year, for the first time, the federal government is going to actually have information about incidents, how they happen, what the adversary did, what vulnerability was exploited, and most importantly, we're going to have a generalizable sample. And so we're not going to have to rely on what vendor A, B, C, D, and E said, although vendor D is wonderful. We are going to actually have a sample that we can do real statistical analysis from and get conclusions that will get us closer to having our discipline being more of a science instead of anecdote.
So the comment about the greatest theft in history touched a nerve, because we actually did 3 studies to try and confirm that. And so I know about 40 governments. I know your counterparts in about 40 governments. I call them out and say, hey, do you guys count like the damage from cybercrime? And the short answer is no. Nobody counts. And our solution for us was to come up with a model to estimate costs, but it's always imperfect and it's not a good basis for policy. So maybe the thing to talk about now is what kind of research, what kind of work do we need to make this data a little more tangible and a little more crucial? Eric, we just picked on you, but we'll pick on you again. So we'll start with Eric and then go down the line.
Yeah. So we have a really significant research gap in cybersecurity. And it's a research gap, we have several, but one that I'll call out is one of what I'll frame as scaled transparency. And what I mean by that is we have pretty good data, thanks to partners like BitSight and others, of what the public-facing internet looks like, right? We know what's sitting out there, we know what the vulnerabilities are, we know where there are assets that are misconfigured. We have decent data, and it will get better, about organizations that are reporting incidents. What we have terrible data about is everything in between. And so we really index very heavily on the bad actors and the vulnerabilities and the reported incidents. But what we know is that for an adversary to actually achieve their action on objectives, to actually do a thing that matters, whether it is stealing data, encrypting data, causing disruption, they don't just pop an internet-facing vulnerability and declare victory, right? They operate through what we commonly call a kill chain to take multiple steps to achieve their objectives. And today, we have a black box in aggregate at scale to say, what are actors doing to actually cause harm? And this is particularly frustrating, I will say, in the context of ransomware, right? Where we know that there are school districts, water utilities, hospitals, small businesses being impacted by ransomware intrusions every single day. And we also know that there are probably a very small number of steps that can be taken to disrupt that attack surface at scale. I can say what I think those are with some fair degree of confidence just by aggregation of anecdotes, but we don't have the data to actually do it in an empirical defensible way. And that's for a very simple reason, because we still have a culture of victim blaming, a culture of victim shaming, where victims don't want to and in fact are disincentivized from sharing granular information about what actually happened, right? Which controls failed, which controls were bypassed, why did the impact actually happen? And until we have visibility into what actually led to an impact, what products were insecure or misfigured, what controls failed, it is difficult for us to say, again, empirically, here are the investments that reduce the most risk per dollar, and here's how we know.
Great.
Yeah, we have maybe there are sort of two major problems with the data collection as Eric indicated. On the one hand, there is a major issue with the scale of data collection that's required across sectors and industries and global environments, because you can't just collect data on individual organizations. They're just individual organizations. What does it mean in the broader context, right? So you need to be able to collect data across a massive environment and do that in a consistent way. The other data challenge that we have is to really understand whether that data has any meaning. Is it correlated to outcomes? Does it cause outcomes? As Eric also suggested. So we have a few different challenges here. The third thing I would say is, how do we do that in an ongoing, continuous manner and not in a static manner? Because that's the sort of the third, maybe even the most significant challenge. Because we don't just want to collect this maybe on an annual basis or every couple years. We want to be able to sort of continuously measure what's happening out in the environment. So some significant data challenges I think that we have across the space. To get to Eric's point, about being able to correlate some of the things that we observe to the things that might be happening inside of the environment, we would look to the insurance industry actually to provide some leadership in this area. Insurance companies are underwriting cyber insurance policies, as many of you are aware, and that has become a very significant business. When a cyber insurance company underwrites a cyber insurance policy, they're collecting information from the organization. The organization is sharing information about their security program, and they're also leveraging other telemetry to help them do that underwriting. Well, cyber insurance companies also are able to observe incidents when they occur, because the first thing that when an organization experiences an incident, they disclose that to their insurance company, which activates the insurance policy and kind of kicks off all the forensics and things like that. So the insurance companies have actually been spending a lot of time on this data problem, gathering a lot of this information and telemetry, and then matching the telemetry with incident information. And they have been publishing a number of studies to try to address some of the issues that Eric is raising about, is there a correlation between, security program effectiveness and likelihood of incident? And some of the early studies suggest that whether it's vulnerability management or endpoint detection, that these are essential parts of a program that are really important. But certainly we need to do that at a broader scale, and I think CISA is a perfect example of where this is probably headed in the future. Congressman.
So I would agree with both with Jake and Eric have had to say. I think the key is to really focus on outcomes, right? Because a lot of things that we're talking about, it lays out what we need to do to get to a stronger place of cybersecurity. But what the hard part is, actually doing the work to get us to that place. It's like we all know what it takes to live a healthy lifestyle and live healthier and longer. You eat right, you exercise. For some of us, maybe we Since we're all in California, all like to have a fit body like Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? But it takes a lot of work to get to that point, and so knowing the what and then measuring the outcomes is really key. There was this study that BitSight recently did and talked about looking at known exploited vulnerabilities and looking at patch rates and were those vulnerabilities mitigated and how long did it take? One of the key things we found there is that because of the work that CISA is doing on the KEVs, that government is patching at a much faster rate than private sector. And that was an outcome of, I believe, the binding operational directive authority that was given to CISA, and they're exercising it effectively. So government is patching at a faster rate. Not so much with private sector. They're not patching as fast at the KEVs, especially in critical infrastructure. So we know that probably the key thing is there. One outcome would be that, do we need some type of a binding operational directive or within a certain time frame for critical infrastructure to get us to a faster patch rate, which would mitigate a lot of those vulnerabilities in the same way that because of CISA's work that we're doing in government, we need to get to that in private sector.
So this really isn't a panel about cybersecurity. That's just to lure you in here. This is a panel about business practices because we are in the middle, or at the start, I'd say, of a change where the business people in the company, not cybersecurity companies, not IT companies, are going to be paying attention to cybersecurity performance. There's good data, not great, but good, that shows a correlation between how well you perform in securing your networks and how well you perform in the market generally. And the better you are at security, the better you are in the markets. Investors will notice that, right? So a change is coming on this industry because of data, because of the link to performance. And the question that's come up is we're much better off than we were, say, 10 years ago or 5 years ago. But do we have the government agency responsibilities, structures, authorities in place to adjust to this new business data-driven environment? I'm going to pick on you again, Eric, because you're sitting next to me. That was a
Indeed, I
mistake,
am.
wasn't it? Yeah. So
Never
why
a
don't you
mistake.
start? This is your big chance to make a pitch for. What do you want to make a pitch for?
Indeed. I think it's worth unpacking for a moment why it is so hard for so many organizations to do the right pro-security thing. And I think the research from BitSight on patch rates for our known exploited vulnerabilities are an exemplar of this issue, right? Where we have seen that vulnerabilities on CISA's known exploited vulnerability or KEV list are patched much faster than vulnerabilities that aren't on the list, but the average is still, and Jake can correct me on the data, there's still several months to patch a vulnerability that is facing the internet that is known to be exploited by an adversary. Which then raises the question, well, that's good that it's months and not years, but how is that possible? Why is that happening? And I think there are three key reasons. The first is because for a given organization, a decision to patch or to upgrade a given technology asset is in part a security decision, but as Jim noted, it is also an operational decision, a business decision, a compliance decision, a governance decision. And although we in this room as security people say, well, obviously, if there's a vulnerability that's unmitigated and being exploited in the wild, the most important thing is to patch it. But most of us also know in the real world, it's actually more complicated, right? And you probably have to go to a change management board, and you probably have to make sure there's no compliance implications. And so recognizing the realities of managing technology and the fact that security is one variable, how can we speak in a better language to people who reflect not only security equities, but also the other equities that are at play for business decisions, like when to modify, change, or deprecate a piece of technology? First issue. The second issue is the fact that there's just way too many vulnerabilities. And the velocity of new vulnerabilities being released and identified is insurmountable for any organization, even organizations with sophisticated, well-resourced vulnerability management programs. There is no organization that can say, yep, we have totally closed every vulnerability in our technology stack, right? It is impossible. So how do we get to a world where we are moving out of the patch faster, patch harder regime? And the only way we do that is by reducing the prevalence of vulnerabilities by design. And so one thing that CISA has been calling on, derivative from the National Cybersecurity Strategy, is for technology vendors to eliminate classes of vulnerabilities in their products by design. And I will just note, MITRE released a paper in 2007 calling out classes of what they called unforgivable vulnerabilities. These are vulnerabilities like SQL injection, like cross-site scripting, that this was, to do some math here, almost 20 years ago, where when a corporation said, these vulnerabilities just shouldn't exist. We know how to fix them. They're dangerous wherever they exist. Let's do better. Almost 20 years later, these are the exact most prevalent vulnerability types that are released and registered every year. And so the only way out of this challenge is to move to a world where organizations are managing fewer vulnerabilities. They are not managing vulnerabilities of the same classes that we know how to address, and then organizations can have a more balanced way of prioritizing mitigation where they occur. Your question was actually about authorities. That was a very long tangent. I apologize. One challenge we face is that to achieve this secure by design vision, we can ask, we can cajole, we can maybe use some contracting language, we can try to create and collectivize customer and consumer demand, but at the end of the day, the technology user community, even the world's largest companies, even the world's largest federal agencies, remain beholden to technology providers who are producing defective products that are insecure by design. And so whatever road we need to take to address that basic problem, that is the only way to a world where we are actually utilizing technology that is safe for purpose, and we can better wrap our arms around the breadth of the challenge.
That is one of the frustrating things about being in this space, is that problems that you saw 10 or 15 years ago are still there, right? And so two of the Five Eyes agencies did a study of what were the most successfully exploited vulnerabilities. They're the same today. I won't tell you which company it was, but I saw the SEC filed a court case against a company recently where they said they false statements. And the one that leapt out to me, it was on page 3, I think, was that the password for the updater was SolarWinds123. Boy, that'll fool the Russians, won't it? So we're making the same problems, the same mistakes we were making for a long time, and there's only 3 ways to change that. The first is market pressure. Stock prices don't work, and your stock recovers. The second is liability. One of the things, maybe we'll have a panel on this next year. Liability is coming, and that's part of the effort here. I think that DHS, ONCD, others are driving. And the third, of course, is regulation. So a different environment where we do need to talk about authorities. That'll be next year, though. Jake, do you want to pick it up?
I'll let the congressman weigh in on some of the government things, and then I'll come back to it, Jim.
Okay, because you, of course, are responsible, or maybe to blame, for much of the structure we have now.
Yeah, blame and credit, I guess. So it's a mixed bag. So I will say one of the things I like about the National Cyber Strategy, that it does address a lot of these key points. Key component or finding in the strategy was to shift the burden from those who are least capable to those who are most capable. And so, yeah, to Eric's point, this issue of eliminating vulnerabilities, left of boom, as they say in the military, is the direction that we need to go. And I think to get there, clearly one of the things that will help that is liability for software companies. We don't tolerate it. For example, a car is sold, and if the seat belts and the airbags or the brakes don't work, well, there's a cause of action there that in the civil justice system. And so I think leaning in that direction is very important. But I would say one of those things that are kind of still left undone, a structural change that I would still make, is one of the things that unfortunately I was not able to get done before I left Congress, although we came close. I highlight the work of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission and the number of important structural changes that came out and resulted because of the work of Solarium, including creating the National Cyber Directors and ONCD position in the Executive Office of the President. But one of the things that we are still left undone was creating a Bureau of Cyber Statistics. And this is it's wonky, but it's a entity that would work on collecting a lot of this data and having it anonymized, but that everyone could use. And it helps to, therefore, then make the business case, say for the CISO, to make the business case to the CEO, to the board, about where we should be spending our next cybersecurity dollar. And so it helps the insurance industry, by the way, and that's another area that I'd like to see a sort of a change. I've recognized early on that the insurance industry has a big role to play here. They're getting better at it. There was a point where they really weren't looking at under the hood as to what would make us more cyber secure. But because of ransomware now, I believe that's what's gotten everyone's attention, and now the insurance industry is looking much more at metrics in this area. But I think that's the major change that I would still like to see done is on creating this Bureau of Cyber Statistics. And I will say, in the posture report that came out yesterday from ONCD, it did highlight in there, it says to create a common operating landscape for cybersecurity. CISA is developing a new cyber analytics and data system. So this infrastructure will be used to integrate cybersecurity data sets, provide internal tools and capabilities to facilities, to the ingestion and integration of data. So this is going to be a welcome addition to the cyber threat landscape remediation and understanding where that next cybersecurity dollar should be spent. But
maybe to Eric's earlier point, when you look at Treasury, Justice, Commerce.
Yeah, that's the one thing I wanted to say. We already do a lot of data
Yeah.
collection. Bureau of Labor Statistics,
BLS.
Justice Department. We should, for crime, we should now have some type of bureau, and whether it's housed at CISA or somewhere else. I think CISA is the right place personally, but
What?
I think. Sorry, Eric, but I think it's important to have that common operating picture, and then knowing where to spend that next cybersecurity dollar, the best outcomes.
I should point out in about 5 minutes there will be a quiz. No, there won't be a quiz. In about 5 minutes we'll give a chance for the audience to ask questions if you have any. If not, I have boatloads of questions, but let's turn to Jake.
Yeah, just to build off that, when I think of some of the regulatory agencies that are collecting data because they have regulatory oversight over cybersecurity, they are able to use that data to make different decisions about areas of focus, areas to prioritize. Hey, we're seeing some gaps in MFA. Let's put that as an examination priority for next year. They're able to make more actionable recommendations to the sector or the industry that they're overseeing. And I think that if we are able to collect more data, leverage more data, create more analysis with that data to make better recommendations, I think that we can use that to improve security posture and performance. I also think that what Eric is saying is absolutely right, that this research that we've referenced a few times today shows the great quantitative results that the CISA KEV program has created. By the way, Does everybody like the CISA KEV program here? Just by show of hands, have everybody's heard of it?
Well, that's an enthusiastic response.
I will say that this is the one thing that I talk to a lot of people about. And everybody like universally has said we love this program. We're really thrilled that CISA has created this thing. And so what we wanted to do was we wanted to understand how could we understand how it's affected the prevalence of known exploited vulnerabilities and the remediation of those vulnerabilities. And what you've heard today is that the data shows that the creation of the program has positively impacted the remediation of known exploited vulnerabilities, not only here in the US, but around the globe. And that's really significant because for the first, one of the first times ever, we're able to bring quantitative data to a program and measure the impact that it's going to have. And we want to keep doing that, right? I mean, we want to keep looking at the impact of that program because while I agree that there is this balance between enterprise cybersecurity efforts and software vendor manufacturer efforts, there's clearly a lot more that we can be doing on the enterprise, I think. But it's only through the data and the quantitative measurement that we can really kind of drill down deeper into some of these issues. And so that's why I think we're on the right path.
So I do want to come back to how the CIRCIA, the SEC rules, the incipient liability rules are going to change the environment. The changes to the federal acquisition regulations, which are in draft or out for comment or coming soon to a theater near you. But before we go to our regularly scheduled program, we already have 2 questions, so let me turn to them and we'll break the flow a bit. Go first, please.
Good morning, Jonathan Cederbaum from GW Law School. If I may, 2 very quick comments and then the question. First comment is, Jim Lewis, you mentioned next year you'd have a panel on software liability. We don't have to wait till next year. We already had one on Monday morning.
No.
Oh.
I was trapped in a room with 20 lawyers at the White House, and they said, this is an important problem, and we should fix it within 2 to 5 years. It's like, Jesus Christ.
That's not what we said at our panel on Monday morning. I was just going to recommend the recording of that session to folks who want to already hear a little bit more about that, led by Jim Dempsey here at Berkeley. Second quick comment is, as I'm sure many on the panel know, but I'll mention it for the benefit of the audience as well, Danny Weitzner up at MIT has been doing some very interesting work trying to collect the kinds of data that you all are discussing, and he's put together some groups of companies by industry that are willing to share anonymized data, and they're starting to put out empirical studies based on the data they've been able to collect. But as all of you mentioned, it's a real scaling problem. And then the shaming problem. Companies don't want to share data and they're hesitant, so it's hard to get data across a large enough group to have meaningful results.
So, and Jim's at Berkeley, so we've already got 3 members of the panel identified. Go ahead.
But the question is, going back to the very beginning, you mentioned that Moody's came to you and said they were going to grade companies based on their cybersecurity practices. Did they offer you any insights about the method they would use?
The one thing I note is that it appeared to me from the outside that there's a correlation between good cybersecurity and good management. And that was why the companies that perform better in cybersecurity, Jake, I don't remember, there was 4 times or something, but there's an improvement in performance, overall financial performance.
Yes, but how were they going to measure cybersecurity performance?
They leverage, sort of non-intrusive data collection like BitSights to form opinions about the security posture of organizations.
I think it was number of incidents and the cause of the incidents, and so you can now collect that and say these people have a vulnerability in this area, they didn't do anything about it, and so they're whacked. And that was what I remember. It's pretty good, and there's now enough available data. Surprisingly, it's taken this long. Enough available data that you can come to conclusions like that.
Thanks.
Do you want to? Anyone else want anything? Is that okay? Your turn, please.
My name's Emily. I work in government, and there's a indictment released this week, or settlement, not settlement, sorry. Someone was charged this week. It was a Florida Turkish national who had been selling fraudulent Cisco products to the U.S. military. And it was $1 billion worth of fraudulent products that ended up in some of our most sensitive military systems. That individual was eventually charged 78 months, and he owes $100 million to Cisco. Is that sufficient for these kinds of threats to our nation's most sensitive systems? And are we lacking the legal tools to go after these people? I think the charge was wire fraud and mail fraud in that case specifically. But the amount of harm to our national security posture is astronomical, and the remediation from a government perspective, we're not getting any bit of that settlement, and now we have to replace $1 billion worth of equipment, and we don't know what kind of compromise that could have led to in the system. So my question is, do you think we're missing the legal framework to go after those types of criminals, especially when they're targeting national security systems and government?
One thing you learn in doing these cases is you have to torque the existing law to fit the person you want to catch, who's committed a crime, and we may not have the full range, but let me ask some of the others. Eric, do you want to start on that?
Sure. So I'm not familiar with the facts of the case, and obviously would defer to my friends at DOJ for whether the existing legal regime is sufficient for the crimes charged. I think, what I would say is there are at least tools at our disposal to address the challenge of fraudulent technology products, the challenge of legitimate technology products that are still defective, insecure, and unsafe is entirely outside of our legal regime. And so I think, just from my point of view, where I sit in the ecosystem, focusing on having some tools to deal with the latter problem while encouraging our partners in law enforcement to maximize the use of current tools to deal with the fraudulent technology chain, I think we do need to go down both paths simultaneously with all urgency.
Anyone else? One thing I'd note too is that we are seeing efforts in the UK and the US and the European Union to start some sort of labeling regime. And everyone knows the underwriter story, which we've only been talking about for 10 years. But it looks like it's finally coming to pass. So that will be, again, a different environment where your product will be graded in some way. But let me go to, was that enough?
I mean, and there's no doubt that the laws have not kept up with technology changes, and constant review and revision is going to be essential.
Next, please.
My name is Jeff Brancato. I lead the Northeast Ohio Cyber Consortium, which is a regional cross-sector ISAC. I'd like to ask you to reflect a little bit more on the opportunity to work with the cyber insurance industry around data collection, and does the context of the regulatory regime for insurance being state-based rather than federally based provide specific opportunities or barriers to going down that path?
That's one for all three of you. I never talk about states, so go ahead.
Happy to start. I think that folks who are not in the insurance world would be very surprised about the data and perspective that insurance companies have on cybersecurity, cyber risk management practices, cybersecurity performance.
And the visibility they have.
And incidents. A lot of incidents, for example, that are reported to cyber insurers to kick off, the policy never become public. So if you think that, insurance companies are sitting on, thousands and tens of thousands and potentially even hundreds of thousands of incidents that never see the light of day because they are not, legally obligated, organizations aren't legally obligated to disclose some of those things. They really are a repository for a significant amount of data and insight about what's happening and what are the effective measures. Now, one of the problems that I think from a government perspective that we have is that's proprietary data to insurance companies. And there have been efforts underway for a number of years to, for government to work more collaboratively with insurers and reinsurers to obtain maybe anonymized data that would help government sort of better understand what the insurance companies were seeing, and maybe they could leverage that to make different recommendations. I know, Eric, that there is some work to spin that program out. So I'll actually defer to you to see.
Yeah, so one of the initiatives that CISA announced this year is an acronym called the CDOG, which is the Cyber Insurance Data Analysis Working Group. Sounds approximately right. But the goal of that effort, as Jake noted, is to establish a third-party intermediary that could do some of the collection, aggregation, and analysis of cyber risk data from insurers, and then work with government and insurers as a trusted broker to derive the kinds of analysis that we think would be useful. That is a very nascent effort, but I think it is one way of getting involvement from insurers, recognizing their unique regulatory environment, and allowing the government to benefit without government being the direct recipient or analytic engine behind that work.
Are you tying that to the new DHS statistical agency that was just created?
So that agency has not yet been created.
Oh, it hasn't. I thought it was
it's
already
on the
launched.
wish
Yes,
list.
so that was a proposal from the Solarium Commission that the congressman helped lead, but that has not yet been established.
Okay.
The one thing I'll say is in terms of federal role on working with the insurance industry in the national cyber strategy was the talk of the role of the insurance industry and them wanting a backstop, for example, and for major cyber losses, similar to probably like TRIA. And I think that there's an area that if we are going to provide that, if the government is going to provide that type of backstop, then the insurance industry has to be more proactive in underwriting these the policies to begin with, but then also hopefully sharing that data that they do collect in an anonymized way.
Great. Your turn. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Thank you all for being here. I'm Leah McGrath, and I lead the State Ramp, which is a nonprofit organization. We work with states and locals, so I care a lot about, probably, thank you for your comments, the vulnerabilities and challenges we see at the local level. We have a security program modeled in part after FedRAMP, and one of the things that we've really tried to do is develop what I would consider an earlier stage kind of maturity assessment for those providers stepping into this, but even working with the lead of SLED, right, the locals in K-12. And so we've really sought out data to try to map to focusing on not just compliance checklists, but what matters most first. I think that's one of the challenges we see in any kind of framework is how do we make sure we're incorporating that data and the research that we have, so we're changing what we're requiring as we go with better learnings. With that, we did layer in the MITRE ATT&CK framework and some of the research that was conducted there to map to NIST 853. And I'm curious as I'm listening, because I love where you're going with the data, but I know it's going to take some time. And I'm curious where the MITRE ATT&CK framework fits in with the work you're doing now or other things like that. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you for your leadership of State Ramp. It is a phenomenally impactful organization, so thanks to you and your team. So we are at CISA, at least, all in on using MITRE ATT&CK as the methodology to understand both what adversaries are doing and then layering that against MITRE DEFEND to understand which controls are most effective against which TTPs. A few items I will note. First of all, about 2 years ago, we began mapping all of our cybersecurity advisories back to attack so that organizations can actually see which TTPs back to attack our adversaries using based upon a given campaign. For those who also had the chance to review the proposed updated incident reporting form that is associated with the new cyber incident reporting rule, one of the things that we are suggesting for inclusion in the incident reporting form is actually asking organizations to note the MITRE ATT&CK TTPs that are associated with each reported intrusion. That would be awesome because then we'd again have that generalizable data set to show across attack which incidents are hitting on which. We also know that that is challenging for some organizations, and so this is actually an area where we are looking forward to comment from the community on does this make sense and how, but absolutely we are looking for ways to leverage attack as a prism through which the data will come to us to enable that analysis.
So I think we're entering a different environment for cybersecurity that's more data-driven. It's linked to authorities and to penalties. And so if we did this again next year, this would be a different discussion. But we're almost at the end of the time, so let me ask our three panelists if they have any final remarks they'd like to make. Congressman, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, it's exciting to be talking about data, and again, as a policy wonk, it's nice to know that we have the right focus now. Again, we know the what to do, and a lot of things are being done. Now it's about measuring the outcomes to see the results of what those efforts will be. And I hope to continue to monitor this. I know CISA is doing incredible work here, and look forward to continue to support the efforts there, and I hope Congress will as well in terms of funding and right support programs. But this is we're entering, I think, a better, different phase in cybersecurity, and it's long overdue.
Great.
When you think of the opportunities that we have to discover the answers to some of our really critical questions in cybersecurity, it's very exciting. For example, leveraging data to identify systemic risk, within sectors and industries, identifying, common points of failure, but then being able to take action on that, do some remediation work. After I've identified, that there's an issue or a vulnerability, can I then, create some remediation activity? Can I, do some outreach? There's so many different things that we can unlock if we leverage, some of these analytics. Grant funding, is like another example. For years, we provide grants to organizations based on, location, and not necessarily based on risk. Can we leverage data to make better decisions about, better funding decisions? Can we invest maybe in different parts of organizations or different types of organizations because of the risk profile that they have, the measurable risk profile that they have. So just a lot of other things that we can do and that I anticipate we will be doing maybe next year, maybe 3 years from now, maybe 10 years from now, but that's the path that we're on.
Final words, Eric.
This is a community challenge. It's got to have a community solution. The U.S. government doesn't have the answers here, and really we need the ideas and the data from the community to actually make progress.
Great. Well, this panel went really well. I do think that we'll have to have a follow-on maybe next year. Maybe I'm not willing to wait 2 years, but thank you very much for coming out today, and we'll see you at the next session.
Thank you.